All right, so in this video, we're going to continue talking about the rise of fascism, and we're going to talk about fascism in Germany now. So, after World War I, the German government had to take the blame for the war and pay huge fines to the Allies as a punishment. So, on top of all of this, Germany tried to form a new government. One that was not a constitutional monarchy like the German Empire had, but now a republic. And this republic is known to history as the Weimar Republic. So it's named Weimar after the city in which the constitution for this new republic was written. It wasn't written in Berlin, and the government wasn't in Berlin because Berlin was way too politically contentious to actively do that. So they had to move to this other city called Weimar, and that's where everything happened to write the Constitution and form this new government. So this new government, the Weimar Republic, had a lot on its plate. They had to, one, figure out how to pay all these fines. They had to rebuild. And three, and we'll get to this in just a second, they had to fend off attempts to overthrow them from the left, meaning the communists, and the right, meaning the fascists. So they have a lot to do, and they are just getting started. It's their first day on the job, and they have to figure out how to deal with all of this stuff. So let's talk about these attempts to overthrow them. So right off the bat, in 1919, there was an attempted communist takeover of Bavaria. Bavaria is one of the southern regions of Germany. It was one of the last of the little Germanys to actually join up with Prussia. So there was an attempted communist takeover of Bavaria, and it took the now minuscule German military and help from various unofficial military organizations too. So basically guys with guns to kick them out of Bavaria. And then after that, in 1924, among other far-right attempts to take over the government, this is Hitler's failed beer hall putsch. Putsch is just a German word for coup. In Munich. And this is famous because after this, he's put in jail. And while he's in jail, he writes his manifesto, Mein Kampf. So there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the Weimar Republic, and you can see it coming from both the left and the right. And it's very obvious why there were these attempts to try to overthrow the Weimar Republic. Life in Germany after World War I was awful. There was a lack of food. There was rampant unemployment. And the terms of the Treaty of Versailles resulted in German hyperinflation. Basically, they tried to print money to pay their debts. And that never, ever works. All that does is make the inflation go up. So there are really famous examples of people burning money, or maybe this was staged, or using it as wallpaper because fuel was more expensive than money. So people would burn stacks of German money because it was cheaper than buying firewood or coal for your stoves. And it's these conditions that opened the door for fascists in Germany. There is a sense of desperation and people were willing to listen to anyone with solutions, no matter how crazy or unworkable those solutions actually were. The breaking point happened in 1923. In 1923, France and Belgium invaded Germany, specifically this place called the Ruhr Valley. because Germany wasn't paying their debt. And so they invaded and started extracting iron and coal to put towards the debt. So if Germany wasn't going to pay France and Belgium with money, then Germany was going to pay France and Belgium with raw materials. And to mediate this, the United States convinces them to leave to allow Germany an opening to help finance the debt. And what we get out of this is the Dawes Plan. And the Dawes Plan we talked about in terms of the Great Depression. This is when U.S. banks loaned Germany money for their reparation payments and indirectly financed British and French Reconstruction. So the German money given to them by the US banks would go to Germany and then go to the British and the French for their repayment or for their rebuildings. And then they would give that money back to the Americans in return for loans that they took out during the war. So we talked about this cycle in terms of the Great Depression. Now, what's interesting here is that between 1924, which is when the Dawes Plan was put in place, and 1928 or 29, depending on when you want to start the Great Depression, was a rare period of peace and economic growth and cultural openness in Germany. It really felt as if things might be getting back to normal during this 4.5 year period. So this is when we see, for instance, the birth of Dadaism in Germany. We talked about that when we were talking about art movements of the 20th century. This is also where we see a new architectural style called Bauhaus, which kind of merges industrialization and architectural design. So it looks as if things may be getting back to normal in Germany during this 4-year period. But this 4-year period did not last, and the Great Depression made things in Germany much, much worse. So all of that economic growth was completely wiped out. And this gives far-right nationalists, basically the fascists, more evidence that there is an international conspiracy against the Germans. None of this stuff happened because of what Germany was doing. All of this was happening to Germany, caused by people outside of Germany. And so foreigners, minorities, Jews, socialists, all of these people were blamed for what happened during the Great Depression. And the primary beneficiary of this was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazis for short. To give you an idea of how quickly things spiraled in Germany, let me give you this statistic. In 1928, the Nazis had 12 seats in the Reichstag, which is the German parliament. By 1930, they had 107 seats. So in 2 years, the number of seats they had went up 10 times. Almost 10 times. 9 times. And a lot of this, a lot of their success, was due to Adolf Hitler, who, like Mussolini, was a charismatic speaker and a good writer. And so people were persuaded to join up with them. Also, adding to this is that they used political violence. So the Nazis, like the fascists in Italy, they had a paramilitary group. These guys were called the Brown Shirts. They were also known as the SA. Attacked the Nazis' social or political opponents. So, Jews or socialists. And this also helped them gain seats because they threatened people who were running against them. By 1932, the Nazis had the most seats in the Reichstag, and the president of Germany, they didn't have an emperor anymore, so they had a president. Names Hitler the Chancellor, which is just the German version of Prime Minister. So, roughly 10 years after Mussolini had done the same thing, Hitler has become leader of Germany. So, this happens in early 1933. Later that year, the Reichstag is set on fire. Now, more than likely, the Nazis did this, or it may have been an accident. But Hitler blames the socialists, and it was almost completely not them. It's very, very unlikely that the socialists actually did this. But Hitler uses this as an excuse to suspend civil rights. And so basically, this is when Hitler takes complete control. So the Reichstag fire is where Germany ceases to be a democracy and turns into a totalitarian dictatorship. The Reichstag passes the Enabling Act, which allows Hitler to rule through decree. Basically cutting themselves out of the lawmaking process. So Hitler doesn't need the Reichstag anymore because now he can just rule by decree. Whatever he wants is now the law. The president of Germany dies in 1934. And this is when Hitler combines the positions to become their Führer, which is just the leader, which is like Il Duce in Italian. And so from that point forward, now Germany looks at the Treaty of Versailles as a checklist of things to remove. So initially, they'll start rearming and growing their military. They'll remilitarize the Rhineland. All of these things are provocative moves, but nobody is really in the mood to do anything about them. And we'll talk about that in our next video. But maybe the most important thing to happen right now is in 1935 when they passed the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws removed the citizenship or citizenship rights for Jews or any non-Germans. So that would include the Roma people, any black people, they were not allowed to marry Germans, or work for the government. And the point of these laws were to make living in Germany so bad they would leave. And a lot of them did. But not all of them. And we will pick this story back up when we finish talking about World War II and we start talking about the active measures that the Germans took to remove these people from Germany. But next time, we'll talk about what the Western democracies were doing about all of this. And the answer to that briefly is not much. But we'll talk about that in our next video. And until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.